So, democracy. Actually, the title tonight would be Ancient Democracy, because to talk about democracy as a whole concept would be a little bit more complex. First of all, a little more than a few days ago, I was browsing some books in the bookstore, and I stumbled upon a book by two Harvard academics. And the beginning of this book, it's a book about democracy, starts by saying, "Is our democracy in danger?" Now, would you find such a question strange? Or would you find such a question okay, normal? But if I say, "Is our Mixleplik in danger?" I would say, "Sergio, what are you talking about? What are you saying? What is a Mixleplik?" But you might be surprised to see that the same problem applies to the concept of democracy. We assume today democracy has to be what? We go to a place, we vote for someone, and that's it. But let's start with the origin of the term democracy. Democracy comes from the Greek word demokratia. Huh?
Demos.
Yeah, demos, yes, exactly. Demos and kratos. I won't inflict you the Greek. So what is demos? Kratos means power, force, could also mean per extension violence, and demos, we translate that as the people. But actually the word demos and the demi in ancient Greek were the villages. Demos were the people who composed the villages. Then becomes becomes a group of people. If some of you remember, for example, when Socrates defended himself in front of the Athenian assembly, he says that he's from the demo of Peloponnesians, which is one of the many demos in Athens. But there were demos inside Athens, outside of Athens. But who participates in a demos? Who is part of this demos that then becomes a very important part in Greek democracy, because every member of the demos will become part of the ecclesia, which is the supreme organ of government, the ecclesia. And the ecclesia is composed by about 5,000 people, sometimes 6,000, depends. Now, who is part of this? So here's what happened. When you become 18 in ancient Greece, and we have to say also that when we are talking about the Athenian democracy, but democracy is usually by us identified with Athenian democracy, but democracy is a concept that exists before the Athenian democracies. The Athenian is not the oldest democracy. And what we are talking about here, it's a very specific, narrow period of time, because there are so many aspects, that it goes from the reform of Solon, Cleisthenes, that reforms the various structure, because the original structure, they were extremely tribal. You were part of the demo because you were part of just a specific group. Sometimes it was some sort of an extended family. What's the fratres becomes the demo, and it was extremely connected to the village where you were living. So you were all related. It was a very close society. Then first Solon, with the first big reform, where the main part of the Solon reform was to divide the population in at least 4 big groups, and also to cancel all the debts, because in ancient Athens, before Solon, you could become enslaved for debts. Which brings us to the topic that slavery is in its nature economical. So Solon, because this was creating a lot of social issues, because you were a farmer, that you asked for a loan to cultivate your piece of land, and then something happened and you couldn't repay the loan, you became a slave. And that was kind of an unacceptable situation, so Solon changed that. So you could not become a slave for debts. And after Solon, then there is Cleisthenes, which is the guy who creates the very first revolution in the concept of democracy, that introduces in the demos, for example, he naturalized a lot of people that were not from Athens or from those groups, which later will become, again, difficult. You have to think that in later times, to become naturalized Athenian, you needed a vote of 6,000 people. But with Cleisthenes, he put all people together because he wanted to avoid the formation of groups of power, you know, because if you are all member of a family, all member of a group, all related, you will act politically in one way that is, you know, specific to your group, and he didn't want that. Now, so what we're saying, after the Cleisthenes reform, how do you become part of the ecclesia, a member of this big group that can vote every law, everything that happens in the state should pass through the ecclesia? And then there was another organ called the boule that was 500 people. And the boule used to prepare the laws and the arguments to submit to the ecclesia. It was that type of relationship. And they all reunite in the Pnyx. Pnyx, which was basically their parliament. In Athens you can still see the Pnyx where people used to go and talk. And the Pnyx, I used to mention this as an important reference, was in the middle between the Acropolis. Acropolis, you know, is where the temples are, where the Parthenon is, etc. And the Agora, which was the square where people used to meet, and Socrates, for example, used to go and talk to the Agora, commerce, etc. So the Pnyx, the parliament, was in between the sacred and the public area where people used to meet. The boule was annexed close to the Pnyx. But again, let's go back to who can participate in the ecclesia. You're an Athenian first, right?
Male.
Male, very good. Age 18. You have not been, or you are not a slave. And you have to prove all these things to the through a certain process called dokimasia. Dokimasia, which we will see why it is important. So we can now think in terms of computer science. You are man. You are 18. You are slave. Can you be part of the ecclesia? No. You are female. It stops there, doesn't go anywhere.
Nice.
You are, but that's not the only, you see, that's already a very, but when we say this, we think, oh, look, they were so old, it was so, well, when women had the right to vote in our super evolved societies?
Previous century, I think.
In the last century, but now it's about 100 years. So that we are so evolved and so cool. I mean, it's just 100 years, okay? It's not that we had women voting for 500 years so we can say, oh yeah, well, forget the Greeks. We have to be careful in our judgment. Actually, women enjoyed some political rights. They didn't have the right to vote, but enjoyed some political rights in Athens. while in other societies, we know even in our societies until recently women didn't have any, and still today there are so many places where women have no rights. So we have to be very careful when we express a judgment about the Greeks. So, for example, in the dokimasia, this analysis, this kind of security clearance, there were questions like, have you ever beaten your father? Have you ever disrespected your family? There were questions like, if you had an altar to certain gods, the Athenian gods, in your house or not. Those could be elements for you not to become part of the ecclesia. The same thing, this dokimasia, this type of process, was in many parts of the Greek democratic process. One, for example, you needed another dokimasia before becoming part of the boule. And another extra test was if you ever been part of any of the coups that have been before, the 30 tyrants, for example, that were before the democratic period, or another test was, for example, you had to pledge your faith, your loyalty to democracy. Democracy was a very important concept for them, that you had to pledge loyalty. You could not become part of the boule by saying, well, I don't care about democracy. You're out. Mm-hmm. Now, but what happens with the Greek and the ecclesia? You have to think that everything that happened in Athens was decided by those people, by everyone who had the right to decide. For us would be, if we translate that into modern terms, everybody who has the right to vote will be able to decide the law of the country. But that's not our case, isn't it? We just have the right to go somewhere and then say, and that's where it ends. That's why for the Greeks, our form of government would be an oligarchic government, which means a government of few that governs over many. The Greeks will say, you're not democratic, you're not democracy. What are you talking about? You're an oligarchy. And actually, I have, Proudhon, the French thinker, that in 1848, he wrote in a book entitled La Démocratie, and 1848 is a significant year because 1848 is the year, of the Great Revolt, is the year that the Communist Manifesto was published, is the Paris, La Commune in Paris, then later the revolution in Milano. All movements that have been suppressed with blood. And Proudhon wrote, La démocratie est une aristocratie déguisée, which means that democracy is an aristocracy, is a disguised aristocracy. Is a form of putting, at least in, but when he said that, he didn't mean the Greek democracy. Because what we see in the Greek democracy, let's say we have to use a geometrical form. What would be the form of the geometrical form for this system of government that the Greeks had? If
it's not a pyramid.
It's not a pyramid.
Must be, yeah.
Very good. Very good. It's not a pyramid. Because if you think, for example, of the people before the Greeks, even Mycenaean people, in Knossos, Crete, where there was the king, etc., they all had a structure, a pyramid structure, as you properly said. On top, there was the king. And depends on where you were, Egyptians, Persians, before Persians, Babylonians, etc. You had here priests, you had here soldiers, you had here citizens, which is an inappropriate term, and you had here slaves. That's the basic hierarchical pyramid structure of the ancient regimes. In our time, you don't have kings, you have presidents. You don't have priests, but you have scientists or academics or lawyers, you know. You still have soldiers, you still have citizens, and we pretend we don't have slaves. But the structure is unchanged. Between the Babylonians and us, the structure is unchanged.
Immigrants.
Huh?
Maybe immigrants. Immigrants.
Immigrant, yeah, yes, exactly. That's why I'm saying we pretend we don't have slaves, but even if we have slaves, for example, in some, especially in the West, you know, Western countries, you know, our products are made in places where people are paid 50 cents a day, so that's slavery.
But the difference is actually that a democratic country must have a division of power, right? So that's, you know, it's not just executive, but also legislative and the jurisdictory power, right? So that's something that controls one another and has to be independent.
Yeah.
In theory, yes.
In theory, yes. But still, the hierarchical structure is the same. Doesn't matter what kind of power you put in between. The hierarchical structure is the same. There is someone in power, and it's from the top to down. Even if you go, for example, what is the most hierarchical and authoritarian structure that we deal with every day? Companies.
Mm.
Companies are absolutely hierarchical, absolutely authoritarian. That's the way our society is built, but not the Greeks. This pyramid doesn't work for the Greek democracy. For the Greek democracy, you should use this. You should use a circle. Where at the center, there is the ecclesia. Or sometimes the ecclesia is also called the demos again, you know, to the demos and the boule. You can have, if you want, you can have the boule inside the ecclesia. But that's how, for every topic, the Greeks were called to decide.
What about female and slaves? They would land at the bottom as well, right?
Yes.
So at the end of the day, you can also draw a pyramid.
Yes, but we are still talking about a society 25 centuries ago, where other societies were like this, where they still had slaves. And for example, there is a famous quote where an Athenian says, we don't know, the old oligarch says, in our place in Athens, compared to Spartans, says, our slaves are treated better than your citizens. Actually, the ancient oligarch laments that, saying, in Athens the slaves are arrogant, they don't give you passage when you walk through, etc., etc. So, this idea of democracy for the Athenians, which is an idea based on some values. One of them is isonomia, the equality, the equality of everyone among everybody else. That's why some people say that the origin of democracy, at least for the part, is in the Hoplites revolution. What it means. When there were battles, if you see the Homeric world, in the Homeric world you have the king, the big knight that goes and fight Achilles against Hector, etc., you know, because they are the only one who can have weapons that are made of metal, because metal is extremely expensive in those times. The small people are using stones, for example. They're just, you know. So, but when you have an advancement in metallurgy, some people say that the advancement in democracy is the advancement in metallurgy, that everybody can have an armor and can become an hoplite. Hoplites were the soldiers. Hoplites. The basic infantry unit of the Greek army were hoplites. They were those advancing in a close formation that later was taken by the Romans, you know, the phalanx, the Romans would call it. But what happens with this military equality? Because when I'm fighting in battle with you, we are risking the same life. There is no difference between you and me. We are in the same situation. So if we are so equal, cannot happen that when the battle is over you say, well, but then you are this and I am the one who gives the orders. So this is one theory. Of course, there are several theories, and again, the origin of the terms democracy. Actually, for the first time, it is used by Persians. In Herodotus quotes, situations where the terms democracy is used, or also indirectly. So, but what happens is that Athenians wanted to be treated all equally. Therefore, they all had equal decisional power in every matter regarding the state. That's where Plato criticism comes later. Because Plato says, how can you decide if you don't know what you're deciding? Which is a question that becomes relevant even for us today. Because today that we give for granted the idea of democracy, for example, in a complex society, but even there was already a problem. Let's say you have to, one example I like is the one about nuclear energy. In Italy, for example, there was a referendum to vote if we want or we don't want nuclear energy. But how can you ask 60 million, 70 million people if they want nuclear energy without explaining them what nuclear energy is?
To understand deeply everything.
There you are. So what happened there? There happens that the one who speaks better, who can convince you better,
Yes.
will make you vote for that or the other issue. And I'm mentioning nuclear energy, but stem cells, all these things that requires a deep knowledge. So I have no way to teach 70 million people if it's right or not to use. I don't even know if that's a legitimate question to apply to such a wide population. Of course, for the Greeks it was easier, because their problems were
Simpler.
sort of, there are famous situations like, of course, farming, internal laws, divorce, stuff like that. But there were also cases where here also starts the idea of deceiving people for a good reason. This is a very important case in history that is not studied. Actually, I was once at dinner with a Princeton University professor that was a professor of political science. He didn't even know this. Political science. And Themistocles. Themistocles is a great Athenian general, famous for defeating the Persians at the Battle of Salamina. But how he managed this is through cheating the Athenians, because there was a mountain where they had discovered some silver. So the Athenians, the ecclesia, wanted to divide the silver among them, because we found it, it's ours, so let's spend it. Themistocles, the Battle of Salamina is in 480s, after the first defeat of the Persians. So the Greek thinks that the Persians are defeated. We're fine, they're not going to come. So if Themistocles would have gone to the Pnyx and tell them, look, I think that the Persians are going to come back, they would have screamed at him, because that was one of the procedures, if they didn't like the thing, they start screaming, so he couldn't say anything. So Themistocles had to come up with some subtle trick and saying, look, I think that there is this other city that will build a fleet, and they could be a menace for us in a certain number of years. So I believe it's better if we divert this funding to build an extra ship, and a new fleet. He convinced the ecclesia, so they diverted the money. And when the Persians arrived, the Athenians had the ship to fight against them. And then they won, and that's a very important step for the entire history of the West. But he did that knowing that he was lying, but at the same time knowing that he could not convince them on the rational basis that the Persians were a big empire, and one defeat was not enough for them. So that's a cheating people, but for a good reason, for their own good. And that's where it all starts, but it goes back again to the topic of democracy, because democracy asks you to go there and decide about everything. But can we do that? That's why I believe it's today we mentioned that many times that Socrates and Plato have been slandered a lot, especially in our society, because we are not a democracy in this sense, for sure. We are an oligarchic system where that's why they came up with the term of direct, indirect democracy, representative democracy. For example, in America, that this is a very odd thing. That I invite you to think about what I'm saying, because it's extremely interesting that if you ask an average American and say, is America a democracy? The answer will be yes, without question. We even had a president that wanted to export democracy through bombing in Iraq, George W. Is America a democracy? If America is a democracy, then I usually challenge my friends, where is that written? Because in the US Constitution, the word democracy doesn't appear. Not even once. America is a republic. It's not a democracy. Which other famous empire in history was a republic? The Roman Empire. And that's why in Latin also there is no word for democracy. When Cicero had to mention what the Greeks were doing, he just said the political system of the Greeks, because he didn't have the word. He didn't have an equivalent term. In America, actually, this is intentional, if we should, but that brings us very far. But James Madison, for example, there are so many passages in the Federalists, especially number 10 of the Federalists, where it's explicitly referring to this. He said, we don't want to go give people power. US senators were not elected until 1913. They were not elected by the people. They were elected by officials, by other officials. The president, yes, the president is not elected directly by the people. Mm-hmm. But everybody in the world, if you go there, say America's democracy, is a democracy. What does that supposed to mean? Go in there, you're doing an X. So I ask you, is it good to have a mixed republic or not? You say yes. Why? Because the guy who said that on TV, I like him, is well dressed, his shoes are very well polished. That's actually, it seems like a ridiculous argument, but this is one of the points that was made, one of the reasons that was mentioned when Kennedy won against Nixon. There was this first TV debate in history, and people say it's because Kennedy was better shaped. So, mixed republic is better shaped, yes. Is that democracy? Do you have any understanding of what you're doing? Where you're going? That's, sorry for the digression, But that brings us back to Socrates, to Plato's argument. People say Plato is a totalitarian, anti-democratic. Yes, of course, because they're so smart. They're so smart. We are surrounded and overwhelmed by the smart of these people. Why is Plato an authoritarian if Plato is exactly saying this? Plato is saying, through Socrates, but also through other passages, saying, when Socrates received the news from the Delphi oracle, saying Socrates is the wisest man around. So he said, that's not possible, that's impossible. Why the oracle would say something like that? But of course he cannot doubt the oracle, because that was for the Greeks like the Pope, and the super authority, So he said, okay, let me see. He went around, he started asking people things. Plato is so malicious to make Socrates go first to politicians and generals, He asked to the general, what is courage? And the general said, oh yeah, the soldier that goes there and kills. I didn't ask you for a person who is courageous, but what is courage? And then he realized that the general doesn't know what courage is. Then he goes to the politicians and says, what is virtue? What is politics? And the politician doesn't know. So then the question that Socrates asks, Plato asks to Socrates, is extremely radical and goes back to this. How can we vote? How can we approve this or that if we don't know what this or that is? If we don't know this mixleblick, is our democracy in danger? How can we know if we don't even know what it is? I would like to mention to you and quote to you, after I've read this incipit of this book by these two Harvard big academics, a comment by a college student named Rosalind that I found online, and she rated this book online by writing, listen, it's a college student, and those are two big, super intelligent, smart professors. This book is a mess. It reads like a first-year college student's paper on why Trump is bad, which, of course, he is. But just because I share the author's view of him doesn't mean I am going to overlook how pedestrian this book is. This is a college student that in 2 sentences can show you what kind of ridiculous book these people are producing. But the point is that it's not that they don't know. They know very well. There is a political reason for us to be confused about the concept of democracy. Because if we're not confused, how can we believe the one who comes and says, please put your yes or no in front of this mixleblick? The oligarchs who has the control of the means to make you think. See, that's we go again back to the concept of Plato and of ancient democracy, which people, again, the smart people that contest and offend Plato, they don't remember, or probably they don't know. I don't know. I decide to ignore them at a certain point because it's ridiculous to talk about something you have no idea about. That before Plato, there is a famous historian called Thucydides. Thucydides wrote the monumental work called the Wars of the Peloponnesian Wars. Herodotus is the founder of history. Is the one who first wrote a monumental, an incredible work of history where he describes, for example, the Persians, etc. This discussion about democracy that is before in the Persians, the relationship that they make between oligarchy, democracy, and the kingship. But Thucydides, by describing the Peloponnesian Wars, that they were one of the most destructive, basically the first world war in history was the Peloponnesian Wars. He starts by telling you a story where there are the people from an island called Corcyra, not Corsica, but Corcyra, which is the modern Corfu, and which was a colony of Corinth, Corcyra and Corinth. These two cities, because they are struggling, they are having problems. Corcyra has a big fleet. They had some battle, some struggle. They go to Athens to convince Athenians, one, to participate in the war against Corinth, and Corinth to say the Athenians, please don't participate in the war against us, because this is going to be bad, because then we're going to call the Spartans, etc. It's going to be a big mess. Now, the argument that Thucydides makes, it is extremely beautiful, and people don't realize this. There's these two groups, they start talking and telling, it's better if you are with us, it's better if you are against us, if you are this, if you are that. And people have to decide. But because they decide according to the rhetoric, the one who is better shaped, the one who can convince you more, they decide to help Corcyra. And that's the reason why they lost their empire. That's the reason why there was one of the bloodiest, for those times, wars that ended basically the Athenian Empire and later democracy. Because we also have to remember that democracy is something that is in those, let's say, if you count all the years of democracy, you have probably top 300 years, if you count it here and there. That's it. Then it comes back in the 18th century. But also with different interpretations, with political use, but democracy was an experiment that started and ended there. Because the Romans were not democratic. Nobody else was democratic for thousands and thousands of years. There was no need for democracy. At least not the Greek interpretation. And then we arrive and we say, oh, we are democratic. We are not. We claim to be democratic. Now, I don't want to go, because as I said, it's an incredible topic, but I would like just to add one little sentence by Albert Camus, who said, La société politique contemporaine, the contemporary political society, is a machine, une machine à désespérer les hommes, a machine to make people desperate. I think it's a very important statement by one of the greatest thinkers and authors of the last century, that faced with the political society today, says that is a machine led to bring people to desperation. Because the interpretation that Plato is giving us of democracy in all his works, when he's saying, before saying that Corcyra is more right than Corinth, you have to know what Plato is saying is that democracy is a paideia. Democracy is a paideia. Paideia means an education, a form of education. If democracy doesn't make you better, doesn't make you investigate the reasons behind things, as Socrates is doing, you know? Socrates is going around and saying, why is this? Toti esti, what is this? It's also not a coincidence that the laws emanates by the ecclesia had the sentence dokei toi demoi. So they started promulgating the law by saying, so it pleases the people, or so the people believe that it's right. Dokei toi demoi, according to the people. Socrates would say, yeah, but is that right or is that wrong? It's a fundamental question. So then you understand why every system that claims to be democratic but doesn't have a paideia before, a concept of education, a concept, first of all, a concept of the human being, then how the human being should be able to understand, it's not a democracy. It's somewhere where somebody's using, and I had here, unfortunately, again, this is to see to this, what we discussed, where there's a very important speech of Pericles. We should probably have started by this. But I would like also to mention a Russian author by the name of Konstantin Pobedonostsev. He's almost unknown in the West, of course, because everyone was being a critic of democracy, at least of the concept that we assume for democracy has been erased from history, completely erased. Pobedonostsev had a few problems on his own, because he criticized democracy, defending through a religious perception, because he was an orthodox representative, etc. But that doesn't mean that his criticism is unfounded, because you see, this is another problem that we face today. We believe that because somebody in power tells me this is black, this is black. And those people in power, because of the means that they have, because you have to consider even the stupidest program, NBC or even Fox News, in 1 hour reaches as many people as you could meet in 10 lives. So there is a huge power there of convincing people of things. So because we have reached that level, we are unable to evaluate an argument for its own sake. Adorno, actually, in Minima Moralia, wrote a sentence that I think is extremely relevant when he says, I think that large part of the problem of our time depends on the fact that logical evidence has disappeared. If I tell you this is an helicopter, if I have enough power, enough means, enough strength, I can convince you that this is an helicopter. Actually, this is Machiavelli's. And this is an answer that Hitler gave to this question. When Hitler was asked, what is propaganda? Hitler said something repeated too many times. The fact that I can convince you of everything gives a power to those who control the means that is almost unlimited to the mind of the people, because you act according to what you believe to be true. What we were saying before, if I tell you outside there is a guy that wants to kill you, you're not going outside. You're not, if you believe me, if you trust me. So I can manipulate you without making you understand that I'm manipulating you. By feeding you false information, by erasing critics of the system that I created. Now, Peloponnesians, again, not great example as man, Dostoevsky used him for the character of the great inquisitor in the Karamazov, so he was kind of a tough guy. But listen what in this book with the chapter "The New Democracy" is saying. Each vote in a democracy representing an inconsiderable fragment of power by itself signifies nothing. An aggregation of votes alone has a relative value. By themselves, individuals are ineffective, but he who controls a number of these fragmentary forces is master of all power and directs all decisions and dispositions. Which goes back, the argument of Peloponnesians is not new, is the Plato argument. Plato uses in the Gorgias the argument of the doctor in front of children and the one who sells sweets. So the doctor wants to convince children to eat carrots and veggies, etc. And the one who sells sweets wants to convince them to have cakes. Who's gonna win if the children have to vote? Cakes. That's exactly the criticism. Plato, at the origin of history, Plato comes after the Peloponnesian Wars. Socrates fought in 3 battles of the Peloponnesian Wars. He saw what happens when people decide without understanding for what they are deciding. And he's saying exactly that. He's saying, you have to understand that before you learn, you cannot decide. That's why he's such an enemy of democracy, such a bad man. Thank you. No, please.